who are unserved or underserved by current broadband connectivity. The plan is intending to act as a catalyst and proactively assisting the region to collect, develop, and prioritize projects and initiatives in order to take advantage of just the tremendous amount of funding that's available right now and going to be available shortly through the bipartisan infrastructure law for broadband. There's a total, just in the BIL, there's about $65.5 billion nationwide. And we want to be able to be prepared to bring as much of that funding to southwestern Pennsylvania as possible. And really, you know, I mentioned this came to light during the development of our long-range plan in 2018 and 2019, but really, you know, in 2020, the emergence of the COVID-19 virus, you know, made us really rethink broadband. You know, we knew it was important before, but, you know, with the emergence of the pandemic and people relying on connectivity more for work and for school and for doctor's appointments and for, you know, connecting with friends and for shopping, you know, it really became evident that there were really large areas of the region that were unserved or underserved by broadband, but also not only that there's a lot of need in affordability programs for certain areas of the region. So, you know, for the southwestern Pennsylvania region to become truly globally competitive, to remain globally competitive, we need to be able to systematically and equitably serve these areas of the region. So now I'm going to turn it over to Jeremy Jurek, our lead consultant. He's the National Broadband Director for Michael Baker International, and he's going to walk you through the current state of the region. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Andy. Next slide. There we go. Thanks, Jamie. So I'm going to take the next 10 minutes to walk through the current status of the region and our process. And what you're seeing here on the map on the right-hand side is the current status of the region. The very first thing we did for this project was to analyze what the Federal Communications Commission had in the way of mapping for this region. If you look at that data, it'll show most of the map is green, and green is good. Green means high-speed internet exists. But due to overstatement of coverage, we knew there were some pockets of areas with issues in this region. So the map on the right-hand side is from one of three data sources that we utilized that actually looks at consumer speed test information. We utilized MLab, Ookla, and we performed our own speed test for this project. If you see areas in red and orange on the map, that falls under the FCC definition of broadband. Those are areas identified as unserved and underserved. And as you can see, most of these areas are in rural areas and also suburban. The areas with very high speed internet access are in a dark green color, are actually not eligible to be seen on this map because there's such a small scale in some of our urban pockets throughout this region. Slide. So, as I mentioned, there is a digital divide, and this exists in both rural and urban centers throughout this region. Rural has many issues with infrastructure, and urban has a lot of digital equity issues with affordability, digital literacy, and broadband adoption. Throughout this region, at a minimum, at least 5% of the region is served by only one internet service provider, and this limits options, this limits services, and also can adversely impact affordability. And as we continue through this program for the next 3, 4, 5 years, broadband rollout will occur and is actually occurring in this region right now through various partners. And one of the things we need to really keep our eye on is tracking that and making sure that we get everybody served in this region. Next slide. So our approach to this roadmap was twofold. We analyzed data and we also had a large stakeholder engagement and public engagement process. So data and engagement was the way we analyzed this project. The very first thing with data is we stood up 2 applications. The first one is called the Broadband Access Index, and the second application is called the Adoption and Equity Index. Both of these web mapping applications can be found on the SPC connected website. The broadband access takes a look at where infrastructure issues exist, and the Adoption and Equity Index looks in more detail at some of the social impacts and factors related to broadband, such as affordability, digital literacy, and potentially where digital navigation centers and advertising for the benefits of broadband would have most impact. Within these 2 applications, next slide, please. Within these 2 applications, we developed what are called connectivity opportunity areas. And what you see on the map here, the areas in purple on the map are those most adversely impacted by having a lack of broadband access, and that's typically due to infrastructure problems. The areas in the light orange color are where there's an adoption and a social impact to broadband. The internet's not being adopted. Folks are struggling with understanding how to use the internet. Potentially there's difficulty with gaining devices to access the internet. And one thing I want to shine a light on for both of these areas is we didn't just look at broadband data sets. We looked at environmental justice factors and also Title VI metrics as well. So we analyzed areas where the population does not have access to a vehicle, minority centers. These typically overlooked populations were incorporated into this mapping. And then the areas in maroon, that's where there's a social and infrastructure impact, specifically in these areas in maroon on the map. Next slide. Within the report, we have an appendix called County Profiles. What you'll find here, and these are live on the SPC website, what you'll find within these county profiles are a 2-pager for each county, and including the city of Pittsburgh, that walks in a little more detail of the current broadband status throughout the 10-county region and within the city of Pittsburgh. You'll find some highlights in here from what we heard from the market research survey, data analysis, and then also some stories from what were called community conversations that we'll be speaking about here shortly. Next slide. So knowing that the FCC data had some potential discrepancies in it in this region, one of the things we couldn't overlook was public engagement and stakeholder engagement and getting the region's feedback. So this was a very thorough process. We literally spoke to over hundreds of organizations within this region through various methods. One of the first methods we used was we launched a public market broadband research survey, of which we got over 3,400 responses. This survey was live from mid-November to mid-December. We also held 5 virtual workshops where we invited a host of stakeholders to these workshops. They were each 2 hours in length, and stakeholders had the opportunity to let their issues with broadband be known, help come up with solutions, and then also start the framework to identify partnerships. We also allowed that workshop to remain open after the live engagement piece so that stakeholders could go in and submit feedback weeks after the workshop. Also, 17 on-site community conversations that we'll touch on in a bit. And another thing we did is we had over 25 industry interviews. And these industry interviews were held with local internet service providers. We did a cross-section of large internet providers and also smaller providers, and then also looked at providers that serve different technologies such as fiber, cable, and wireless communications. We also spoke with other regional entities within the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania and even some outside of Pennsylvania. Finally, also spoke with DCED at the state. And I should mention we had 2 forums in which we could touch base with throughout the project. The first was a regional advisory committee which had over 40 members on it, including local legislation. And we also had a steering committee with a 15-member board that also included the Commonwealth on it. And finally, the last thing I'll mention about engagement here, we spoke with every county in the region and the city of Pittsburgh to help develop these community and county profiles and to help inform this final roadmap. Next slide. Okay, I will pause here and I will now turn it over to Laura Stephanie to speak more about the work done in public engagement, specifically in organizing and conducting the community conversations.
Thanks, Jeremy. So the main goal that we had with conducting the community conversations was to really uplift the voices from our community, from ordinary citizens, to aid in providing equitable internet access for all. We really wanted to use these in-person sessions to just get an on-the-ground kind of viewpoint, wanting to understand how and where the community members access the internet, why they are using the internet, what they need from their service, and what are some barriers they're facing. How do we address the gaps in their needs? We know that with this unprecedented opportunity to shape public policy and to build infrastructure, it's really going to be the best practice in order to craft the best policy and the best solutions to actually involve the community that we're hoping to impact in the conversations in order to shape the future. So as Jeremy detailed, Michael Baker assisted our team in utilizing GIS maps and associated statistics to query out the top 15 locations that match our criteria for the community conversations. He had mentioned, economic data as well as access to a vehicle, Title VI communities. We also looked at racial demographics, income levels, looking at rural communities versus urban communities. And this process resulted in the identification of 15 locations in the 10-county region, with each county represented by at least one location. And actually, there ended up being, in the end, 16 in-person sessions, which the 17th session was with the Latino Community Center in order to have a Spanish-speaking session that was attended by 30 participants. That was held virtually, as was the preference for that community. But with the local partners that we have, we vetted the list of locations and identified areas where we would actually be able to find a good deal of people. Where do people go? We hosted these sessions in libraries and in school districts. We've partnered with community organizations. We wanted to have a kind of on the ground viewpoint from our local partners and from the experts to make sure that we were doing this in the right places. Because I always like to tell a story about how just because the computer model suggested something, that doesn't mean that it's necessarily the best location. We had one area in Indiana County come up as kind of off the charts, but that was an Amish community. So we worked with our partners there at the local United Way and in economic development to end up hosting that at a school district in Indiana County. And we found that in the more rural counties, we actually had really great attendance because this issue is so big for them. It's, as Jeremy alluded to and as Andy alluded to, it's an issue of not affordability only, but it's also access, just not having the infrastructure built in those areas. So we had these sessions and we wanted to just kind of go through some questions, finding out how does the internet help individuals, finding out, what kind of feedback do they have with respect to digital literacy? Do they feel like even if they had access to the internet, would they be able to utilize it properly? We heard from a number of individuals that people wanted to get to know how to use the internet, but didn't have opportunities available. And I'll go back to what Jeremy mentioned about, access to a vehicle. We spoke to some elderly people in Westmoreland County at the Jeanette Public Library who mentioned, having to take 2 buses to get to the local community college in Westmoreland County to take classes to improve their digital literacy, but that ended up being a 2-hour commute each way, and that the bus service was a little bit sketchy and not reliable after 6 p.m. when the classes were offered. So there are so many issues that are impacting this community and so many kind of hands in the pot trying to work with these populations, but we really wanted to use these conversations to sort of connect the dots and find out where the gaps are. So digital literacy, that was a huge theme that we noticed. We want to touch on also the rural versus urban themes. I alluded to it already, and Andy had also mentioned it earlier, that affordability is an issue that we did see in urban areas, not as much in rural areas. In rural areas, it was more about availability. But across both the rural and urban areas, we did find that work and school were the primary uses for internet. And in rural areas, there was actually a higher instance of using the internet for online classes for adults. Also, a key factor between both rural and urban communities was using the internet to communicate with friends and family. But in urban areas, we saw that there were more individuals who used internet to communicate with family members who were located internationally. We also saw a higher instance in rural communities of the internet being used for telehealth appointments because they have a longer driving distance and they don't live within close proximity to a number of medical providers. And also within the rural communities, we saw that the internet was used for ordering groceries online, which is helpful due to their distance from commercial centers. So a number of the concerns across the urban and rural areas that we found in our community conversations were cost and also just access. We did see that kind of across the board. The rural areas, as we've mentioned, were frustrated with a complete lack of access and unreliable connectivity. We talked to a group of seniors in Westmoreland County who lived in South Huntington Township, which is near Yukon. And they were actually well connected with legislators and had reached out to try to get this issue reconciled, and were told that they just didn't live in a well-populated enough area for it to make it worth the internet service provider's while. It wasn't profitable enough for them. There weren't enough people there to really entice the internet service providers to provide access there. So they were faced with driving 20 minutes to get a signal. We also had a great story from a reporter from the Farm and Dairy newspaper who had to go out to the middle of a field to get a signal to do her work. So I'm not sure if that person is on the call today, but that was something that we heard reported in one of our sessions that we had, I believe, in Beaver County. And another issue that I just want to highlight is this is an issue of, equity. We see that the populations in terms of families that are already kind of far behind and children who are behind in school who have lower test scores, those are the same populations that don't have proper access to internet. So whenever the pandemic hit, we saw this as something that was just increasing inequities that had already existed. So it really just exacerbated things. So we see this in my position as a policy advocate for children, impacting children not only from a health standpoint, as we've talked about telehealth and access to services, but access to education as well. And it's also an economic development issue. We had individuals who are small business owners who ran childcare facilities in the counties who had trouble getting online to file tax paperwork in order to continue operating their facilities. And we know what a crisis we have with childcare right now and how people can't go back to work if their kids don't have somewhere to go that's safe for them during the day. People pulling out of the workforce because of the childcare crisis. And knowing that there are people out there that want to provide the service, but that internet access is a barrier is just unacceptable. So we had a lot of great stories that are in the kind of sub-report, which is linked off of the connectivity roadmap. It's also on the Allies for Children website. So I would encourage people to take a look at that. There are a number of stories and personas that reflect the diverse populations that we saw. And finally, I'm going to just mention that it wasn't just to talk about barriers and problems. We were really excited in these conversations to hear from residents about proposed recommendations, what would be helpful to them. And some of the answers were really just fantastic and aligned with, public policy solutions that we had been researching. And to hear that coming from the community that we're hoping to impact with the changes that we're recommending was really great. So some of the examples that you'll see on this slide are regarding when new housing developments are being built, ensure that they're equipped to handle high-speed internet access. Maintaining the older lines in the more rural communities where they're overgrown and people are having to drive out to fields to get a signal. We were just excited to kind of have the population that we're trying to work for and on behalf of be a part of actually crafting these solutions. And I know that Andy is going to talk a little bit later about some solutions in more depth. So we were really excited to kind of provide this snapshot of what's happening on the ground. And at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Karen Lightman. Metro 21 at Carnegie Mellon University, they've been very involved in this initiative. And Karen Lightman there is their executive director. She's going to talk about some ways to kind of connect what we've heard from the community and the relationships that we've started with community members into action. So I'm excited to turn it over to Karen.
Awesome. This is great. And just listening to this presentation so far, I'm getting more energized about the potential. And I think this has been, just to pause, like this has been probably one of the most thoughtful and comprehensive projects that I've worked on an issue that is affecting all of Southwestern Pennsylvania. And I feel like through the work that we've been doing, we'll be able to position the region really strongly to get the full advantage of that funding that Andy was referencing before. So I want to talk to you about the work that Carnegie Mellon did as a part of this comprehensive project. And in particular, it was this idea of if you don't know what you don't know. So if you're living in a rural community and you are used to having your internet, just crap out on you, and you don't have the ability to do telemedicine, you may not fully understand what the realm of the possible is. So what we focused on, one of the projects that's highlighted here, is this idea of a campaign, a public service campaign. And we worked with third-year students at the School of Design, Count Us by Connecting Us. And there will be a hyperlink that you'll get, and you'll see some examples of some great public service announcements, some short videos to help kind of put into action a call for action for people to get interested, excited, and politically active. To get activated to take their voice and express that they believe that that internet is a public utility, much like the ability to turn on the light and turn on electricity. That everybody should have affordable access to quality broadband. And so what was great about this is we had the folks from Michael Baker come several times, as well as Allies for Children, and we met with the students, and they were out, they created some really great videos that you'll see, as well as like this idea of multi-platform. So like at bus stations and maybe at the dollar store, like figuring out where are ways, touch points to reach those populations so that they can demand really that they have access to equitable broadband. And again, the information that we got from the mapping exercises, the community engagement, the listening sessions, the survey helped inform this, so that our hope is in this next stage of this project, we can use some of this information to help spread the word about the importance of broadband, and that people can really use their voices to say that this is something that we want, for our communities, for economic development. And so I think that's really the basic of what I want to talk about with this project. And again, it's this idea of getting people interested and involved. And there's some great examples of where we had third-year students, so they were on Instagram. And this idea of how can we get to different populations like elderly and suburban and urban and rural, and better what are ways to better communicate to those communities that have been left out and can use their voice for a call to action. Next slide. I want to talk a little bit more holistically as well as some other work. So it's the policy. So I think part of what we talked about is from a technology standpoint, you know, what if we're talking about broadband, and you'll hear from the folks a little bit later about, you know, what specifically, what future proofing investments can we make to ensure that the broadband the investments are done equitably, and they're also a catalyst for the private sector to you know, see opportunities. And then there's the policy. And so what we worked with Professor Rick Stafford in his class with Heinz College was it's a class on elective politics and policy making. And I had the opportunity and other of my colleagues to present to that class. And they were got to learn, you know, do a deep dive on all those great maps that SBC and Michael Baker did to better understand, again, like what are the critical issues and what are the policy implications. So no, not just from a technology side, but also from a policy implication and this issue of equity. And so this, if you improve broadband access for everybody, and yet there's a gap, and you just improve it marginally, that gap still continues. So there's opportunity for policy interventions as well as technology. And speaking of technology, Professor John Piha, who was the former Chief Technology Officer from the Federal Communications Commission, played an extremely active role in forming the outcomes of this report that you'll get access to, and better understanding, again, from a technology and a technical as well as a policy perspective. And I think the key thing that he would always echo is, you know, we need to trust but verify the maps. We need to find ways to advocate for Southwestern Pennsylvania so that we can get as much funding as possible. And then I think the idea of future proofing, that we need to make sure that we are investing in the right plan, not just necessarily something individually, but it's more holistic. And then lastly, on Friday, I had the opportunity to take part in a fantastic broadband symposium hosted by the University of Pittsburgh. And I hope some of you were able to see that, because we had like almost 200 people in attendance focusing on how to position Pennsylvania, and in particular Southwestern Pennsylvania, so that it can be well positioned to get as much funding as possible from that Investment and Infrastructure Jobs Act, that $65 billion nationally that Andy was referencing earlier. I'm happy to answer any questions. I'll be here for the full time. And so with that, I'd love to hand it over back to my friend and colleague, Andy. I think next slide, please, who's going to talk more about these proposed solutions that I've been alluding to. So what's great about this work is it's not just a snapshot of a description of what's happening, but where do we go from here, and how do we position our region to take full advantage? Andy, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Karen. Next slide, please. So as Karen alluded to, Jamie, did we skip one? No, maybe not. Okay. So, you know, as Jeremy discussed earlier, we developed the two mapping applications, which came out of that are the connectivity opportunity areas. And those areas represent, you know, as Jeremy said, the intersection between broadband access and adoption are the lowest, and where we have the highest concentrations of the most vulnerable population. So your low income, your older adults, your disabled populations, your populations with limited English proficiency, and so on. So, you know, these are the areas that we've identified of the greatest impact and the greatest need. So, and also too, you know, there's a possibility, you know, once we start, you know, implementing this roadmap as a region, these could be areas where there could be incentives provided, such as streamlined permitting, tax credits, or other things that may have a big impact in spurring high-speed connectivity deployment. You know, and also, just as Jeremy said, the challenges that impact the urban, suburban, and rural locations are really varied, and thus the potential solutions and the highest needs will vary as well. So, you know, just an example, the city of Pittsburgh, access really isn't a problem, but affordability is a problem, and you know, in the city and in some of the areas, for example, such as, you know, some of the Mon Valley communities. And when we started this this program, you know, the intent initially was to go in and start to develop projects for all of these COAs and all of these areas of high need from across the region, but then realized, you know, once we were into this and started doing more research and digging into what, you know, our partners at the counties were doing and partners at other, you know, nonprofits and you know, internet service providers, you know, we realized that there was a lot of moving pieces, and a lot of the areas are being served. You know, some of our counties in the 10 county region have done just a tremendous job in using their American Rescue Plan funds and using other funding avenues to gather funding to serve the unserved and underserved areas. So, you know, instead of developing a you know, a set of 50 or 60 projects that come to the region and then could be, you know, obsolete by the time we start to apply funding, we thought it would be better to provide really a toolkit to our partners in the counties to guide them in the selection and development of priorities. And you know, that owes to the fact of, you know, as Karen mentioned earlier, future proofing. So we don't want to, you know, recommend a set of projects, and by the time that we secure funding for them, they're obsolete, excuse me. So, you know, basically, again, you know, just to use this kind of, we pivoted just to use this as a tool and a guide to, you know, for implementers to start to develop their projects. However, we did develop a set of 14 pilot projects that could be used as pilots that represent the highest need areas from across the region. So with the, also with part of this initiative was to develop a set of SMART goals. You know, these 12 regional goals that you see on the screen provide a framework for all of the partners, counties, municipalities, nonprofits, other partners, educational institutions to situate themselves within the regional efforts and to identify strategies that they can undertake to help build on for the region. These goals were developed out of the comprehensive stakeholder and public engagement process that Jeremy and Laura and Karen discussed earlier. Also with regional expert guidance, participation from local leaders, and again, just a tremendous amount of outreach from across the region, also informed by case studies, example projects, and other programs that have already been successfully implemented across the nation. You know, so the main challenge of these goals that they seek to overcome include physical barriers, awareness, understanding, securing funding, and affordability. So each of these 12 goals have a variety of suggested strategies to assist the overall program with implementation. Overall, there's about 75 strategies in total across the 12 goal categories. Next slide, please. So some of the priority actions that we're recommending, and these are, you know, these are just a selection, a summary of efforts and strategies that are included in the report that you'll see after the presentation here. I'm not going to go through and read these, but just want to hit a couple highlights. In terms of regional efforts, at the Southwestern Pennsylvania Commission, our board of commissioners, which is comprised of county commissioners and their appointments, folks such as the mayor of Pittsburgh, the Allegheny County executive, members from PennDOT and the Port Authority and the governor's office and DCED, just a wide range of you know, our commissioners. We started to develop a commissioner work group to help staff and our partners here at Carnegie Mellon and CMU and Michael Baker to prioritize these strategies and assist us in developing regional policies centered around broadband projects and programs. And we're anticipating those work groups to start up in May sometime. You know, we want to be able to select a role for SPC as staff and as the commission to support regional needs as best as we can, but also to remain flexible, owing to the fact that I mentioned earlier that a lot of the counties are doing a great job on their own. we don't want to stand in their way when they're, applying for funding and developing projects. However, we want to be a resource to our counties and our members and the region. We want to be able to provide technical assistance or policy assistance or data gathering and synthesis and public input and things like that. So we want to be able to be flexible in our role as SPC and partnering with our counties going forward. We're also going to be developing a regional marketing campaign to promote the benefits of broadband and highlight existing broadband affordability programs. That's going to be begin to be undertaken in the early summer. So again, with the media outlets that we have with us today, we'll be looking back to you to help us in getting out and spreading the word. And just want to mention, I mentioned earlier, the Hillman Family Foundation has provided most of the funding for this effort, but they're also committed in funding the implementation phase as well, and providing technical assistance to the region and the multimedia campaign. We have the Michael Baker team led by Jeremy under contract for the next 3 years to be able to assist the region in implementing the program. Next slide, please. So with county and municipal leaders, again, just a sampling of some of the initiatives that they can undertake. Really, one of the most important ones is for them to advocate to local, state, and our federal representatives to ensure that local needs are understood and addressed, including accurate data representation and policy changes that we may need to spur broadband development, anything from zoning and land use, and again, to permitting. And also to address, help address expanded regulations over service and cost inequities. Next slide, please. Finally, private sector and nonprofit partners. We're encouraging our private sector and nonprofit partners, the business communities and other nonprofits and educational institutions and school districts and the healthcare industries to set organizational level goals and committing themselves and implementing connectivity for all. Some examples with that may be to commit speed and service thresholds for the providers, commit funding allocations for affordable subsidies to nonprofits and foundations, and then to create digital literacy programs for the institutions. And we're also encouraging and going to be promoting the roadmap advocacy toolkit that we have available on our website that you'll see with the press release here in a little while. Just a tremendous amount of resources available, from the mapping to social media toolkits to community engagement and education packets, just to spread awareness about existing resources and programs, as well as the regional goals and strategies. Next slide, please. And that's all we had for you this morning. And I haven't, Jamie, I know you're monitoring the chat, so if there's any questions, the team would be happy to answer them.
Yeah, it looks like, so at this time, I do not see any questions. So I would love to invite anyone on the call that does have any questions, if you would like to submit them in chat, and just add, oh yes, where can you get a copy? Okay, so Chris would like to know where he can get a copy of the report, and that is actually online on SPC's website. So I will actually add a link to that directly in the chat for everybody, because that is live, and you'll see as well with the press release. So the report, the connectivity roadmap, as well as the appendices, is now online. All right. Does anyone else have any questions for Andy or Karen, Laura or Jeremy that you would like to ask? And since there's only a few, if you just wanted to unmute, that would work as well. Okay. Chris is asking, only 36,000 households in the 10-county region without internet? I think, Jeremy, I think that one will go to you. And I might be able to.
Hey, Jamie, yeah, if you could go back to that slide.
I sure can. And I can go back to this.
Hey, Chris. Yeah, good question. So in the report, you'll find more detail about this. This is just kind of a summary graphic. Actually, Jamie, if you could go to the slide you're on previously, there's a chart on the right-hand side. Here you go. Yeah, so based on mapping and available data, these are the numbers that we're seeing for households, businesses, and what we call community anchor institutions, which are government locations, libraries, education centers, locations where the public would visit and require internet access. Again, though, I'd invite you to, you'll see this graphic in the report, and there's more detail about how this number was created, where it came from. Just some more details there.
Thank you, Jeremy.
No problem, Chris.
I also want to point out too, Chris, just to add on to Jeremy, that keeping up on the data is going to be very important for this. We both have mentioned earlier that there's a lot going on and it's moving very quickly, and a lot of there is deployment projects going on as we speak. So one of the things that we will need to keep up on is, especially for the FCC broadband mapping that's coming out later this year, that's going to be used to determine funding amounts, is, to keep up on where there's deployments happening and being able to take a look at the FCC mapping that's coming out and, really be ready to question that mapping and, provide data backup for our questioning. And so if we see an area on the FCC mapping that is they're saying is served, that we know that is unserved, we can submit a challenge to that, and that makes the state of Pennsylvania and therefore the region eligible for more funding to come in to the area, because there will be more need demonstrated than what the actual FCC mapping is showing.
Thank you. Thank you, Jeremy and Andy. And we have another question from Sarah Donaldson. Thank you, Sarah. Did any of the areas you looked at face challenges with both access and affordability? Or did those two issues seem to appear mostly in separate areas from each other? And I thought this might be a helpful visual. And I'm wondering, Jeremy, would this be you again?
Sure, I'll go first. Andy, or anybody else on the call too, feel free to jump in. So there are certainly areas within the region where that issue impacts, both of those issues impact the same location. Even just data-wise, we did see that. So the areas in maroon on the map are exactly what you just referenced, Sarah. And again, this is what the data showed. So even just through stakeholder and public engagement, especially those community conversations that we had, the 16 on site and the 1 virtual, we heard that same story, that there were infrastructure, and I like to break it into infrastructure and social issues, that they could coexist at the same location. Absolutely.
I'll just piggyback on what Jeremy added. Anecdotally, we did hear that, yes, it wasn't one or the other. There were several instances that we heard from stories of residents where those issues overlapped, both affordability and access within the rural communities as well. We had people talking about, how we actually had a great person who she was from Beaver County, but she attended an Allegheny County session because she worked in Wilkinsburg. And she talked about, she was okay with what she was paying for internet, but it was, over $100 a month for her mom's internet access in a rural community. And that's just unacceptable. And this woman actually also worked with seniors in services for seniors for her living. So she saw, from my perspective as a child advocate, I'm always looking at kind of a younger population, but we saw through this effort and through the story of this person who worked with seniors, just how isolated a number of seniors felt, not having proper access, not having, even if they do have access, not knowing how to work it. So that was an issue that we saw throughout urban, rural, and suburban.
And if I can just piggyback on what my two colleagues have talked about, I think the underlying issue is that there's no requirement for transparency in either of these indicators. So the ISPs are not they are not required to say how much they're charging. So the price and the cost of internet service is not transparent. So part of the survey that we did was to uncover some of that information, as well as the quality that in the past, the FCC, it was self-reported, the ISP self-reported what the speeds were, and they could do it by census block. And in a rural area, a census block could be miles. It could be quite large as opposed to a city block, perhaps, or a small area in an urban area. So part of the challenge that we had is that historically, both of these issues about access and affordability have been, hidden and not transparent. So this is part of this policy issue as well that we tried to uncover here.
That's an excellent point, Karen. And I mean, we really can't overstate just the fact that the FCC data with respect to areas that are served, it's really overstated. So we saw that so much in our conversations. Something that we haven't touched on a lot throughout the conversation today too is just the number of people that we saw who their only internet access that they have is through their phone, which is just not going to cut it for the levels of virtual schooling that we've seen, even just doing your homework and turning in your homework. That's still done digitally for a number of schools, even though we're back to in-person. Telework, that's not really going to cut it. So that's something that I also wanted to just kind of throw out there as well as we think about what the areas served and underserved really look like across the region.
Thank you both very much, all three of you actually. Now, do we have any additional questions from anyone else? Looks like chat is quiet. We have another couple minutes. Well, if we don't have any additional questions, definitely encourage everyone to check out the connectivity roadmap. That is on the URL we just sent in chat, and then stay tuned as Shannon will be issuing the press release momentarily. If you haven't already received it, I think you may have received embargoed copies. And so we would love, if you could help us get the word out. And if you have any questions or anything pops up later, please feel free to reach out to us. We're happy to have, to help in any way. And we really appreciate your time today. Thank you, everybody.